Hey, quick favor, we need your input. For a few weeks this August, we are going to be giving ourselves our usual late summer break, and as usual, we'll be running some favorites from the archives. But this year, we are asking for your help in deciding what to run. In our newsletter, we're going to be doing a series of votes on what episode we should feature each day. So it's up to you to chime in, and that will help us decide. All you have to do is subscribe to the This Day newsletter at thisdaypod.com. We'll be sending out our first poll soon, so jump on it. Hey there, welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. And today, an episode that will hopefully provide some context for one of the biggest stories taking place right now. We usually do these context episodes on Sundays, but this story was really playing out over the weekend, so I wanted to wait until today, Monday, to bring it to you. As you may know, at this moment, there is a contingent of Democratic legislators from Texas who have fled the state and are camped out in Illinois. They are doing this because Republicans in Texas are proposing a drastic redistricting of that state, which would greatly benefit Republicans not just in Texas, but add up to 5 seats for Republicans in Congress. The proposal is happening between redistricting cycles, and Republicans, from Donald Trump down to legislators in Texas, are basically admitting that this is a ploy to get more congressional seats in next year's midterms. They're really not hiding the game here. Redistricting and gerrymandering have always struck me as at odds with the basic idea that a democracy should represent all people equally. This is taking things to a whole new level, and it fits right in line with the more aggressive anti-democratic approach to elections on the part of MAGA Republicans we've seen over the last 10 years or so. And Democrats in Texas and elsewhere are trying to figure out how to respond in kind. There is talk of states like New York and California doing their own emergency redistricting to even the score. That, of course, has led to questions of whether that tit for tat would just start a race to the bottom in American politics. And honestly, I hear those concerns, but I also think it's worth asking whether we are already at the bottom, which means you just have to do what it takes to fight for democracy. One part of the story that's playing out in Texas right now that I think is really interesting is that the Illinois governor, J.D. Pritzker, has basically housed these Democrats in exile. And there's some really interesting cross-state solidarity there. I think that's the kind of approach that is needed. It is time to get creative, and it is time to get bold. So a lot of this feels new, but that is not to say that it is completely unprecedented. In fact, we did an episode about the time in 2003 that a bunch of Texas Democrats fled the state in order to stop a debate about a controversial redistricting plan. And fleeing the state of Texas to hold up legislation is kind of a tradition of sorts. It feels like every generation of legislators kind of has to go through that rite of passage. So here is our episode about that 2003 story. You'll hear the parallels. Hopefully it gives you some context. You'll also hear that this is from when the show was just me and Nikki, though we do have a very special guest. This was also from May of 2020. So listening back actually for being recorded deep in the middle of lockdown, I think it sounds pretty good. Anyway, take a listen, share it with anyone who needs some of that historical context. It's coming up right after the break, and we will be back with a new episode real soon.
Communication is critical to your success in your personal and professional life. I'm Matt Abrahams, and I teach strategic communication at Stanford Graduate School of Business, and I host Think Fast, Talk Smart, the podcast. I sit down with experts to discuss actionable advice that you can immediately apply to your life. We cover topics like managing communication anxiety, speaking better in the moment, maximizing your influence, and how to negotiate to get what you want and need. Listen wherever you get your podcasts to level up your communication.
Hello, and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, May 12th, 2003, arrest warrants are put out for over 50 Texas state representatives who have fled to Oklahoma. Here's the story. The group of Democrats were trying to prevent a redistricting vote that would have given Republicans more power in the U.S. House of Representatives. The Texas House needs a certain number of legislators present in order to vote, so this group of Democrats vowed not to appear. But if they had stayed in Texas, they could have been compelled to show up, so they fled to a hotel just across the border in Ardmore, Oklahoma. Oklahoma. And they camped out. This story's got it all: redistricting, hardball tactics, a catchy nickname. They were called the Killer D's, and of course, cheap hotels. I'm joined, as always, by Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hi, Jody.
And back with us is Harry Enten of CNN, a man for whom instructions to stay indoors all day, order takeout, and not do anything are really not much of a problem at all. Harry, welcome back to the show.
Shalomi, my homies.
So this story is just unreal, and we'll get into some of the details of it. But I don't know, Harry, I just want to get your thoughts. Like, does all the good stuff happen at the state level? Like, is that just where all the crazy stories are?
I think so. I think that's where all the good stories happen. It's always, to me, where the best political scandals are either on the state or the local level. And in fact, the lower levels, it seems to have the best stories, if for no other reason than those are the people who are most poorly vetted going for office. I mean, we'll get into this a little bit, but I'll just note that I remember watching this at the time and thinking, this is the most insane thing I'm ever seeing as it comes across my television screen. And it was the first time I found out that, in fact, the Texas Rangers were not just a baseball team.
But in fact, people who could be sent to fetch elected leaders from a neighboring state. I do want to add one piece of context here, Nikki, and then we'll get into the particulars of this wild story. But we should point out that this is a moment, not that long ago, where Democrats are in control of Texas, a state that obviously we now think of as deeply, deeply red.
Yeah, it's at that time in the not too distant past where Democrats had this very conservative wing that had, you could say, a legacy holdover from when the South was solidly Democratic, and those Democrats tended to be, at least culturally and sometimes economically, very conservative. And they outlast what we normally think of as the switch between the two parties. I mean, they're in power in southern states and border states into the 1990s.
Yeah. We kind of think of 2010, or at least I think of 2010 as the big year in which redistricting, especially for Republicans, really started to reshape a lot of American politics. And, you know, obviously it's tied to the census. Harry, should we think of this as kind of like an early bellwether flare-up incident for some of the redistricting fights that then sort of came up over the course of the next decade?
No, I absolutely would view that. I mean, I think most people who know gerrymandering now and know about drawing the House lines probably didn't think very much of it during the 1990s, but there were, in fact, a few mid-decade in the 2000s redistricting fights, one in Texas that we'll be talking about. There was another one in Georgia. And so this, to me, you know, tells you it's not just about who votes and how they vote. It's also about who's making the rules. And this became the big thing, good government, and the idea of good government in terms of fairness. This is the beginning of that fight. And you saw it very, very well play out in Texas.
Yeah, I think that's really important to point out because nowadays we're so used to talking about gerrymandering that we think of it as this sort of perennial political issue, but it didn't really become something people seem to passionately fight about outside of state houses until the last 10, 15 years or so.
Yeah. And certainly this is a point at which, I mean, this happens as a result of the 2000 census, but it's not until 2003 that Republicans feel like they're in a position to now take on some redistricting in Texas. We should say that Democrats had been pretty aggressive about districting in the 90s in Texas, and so this was Republicans feeling like they had their chance to even the ledger a little bit.
It is important to point out that, as we were hinting at in the beginning of this episode, Texas was a red state by this point. The votes that Democrats were getting for the House were not necessarily reflective of the number of seats that they were getting. But I just think that the idea of going across a state line and then doing this was almost something that you would think would come out of a movie. And I recall at the time, I'm like, what the heck is going on here? Which I think gives you an understanding of what exactly they were doing.
Well, rereading this, I mean, I think it should be a movie, and I want to call dibs on turning this into some sort of scripted series or something, because let's just get into some of the specifics here. So you have this group of Democratic electeds who basically say the House can't convene and the House can't take on legislation unless there's enough people there, right, physically present. So they say, well, if we take X number of us and get out of here, they won't be able to take on this legislation. But it's not. And the reason they go over the border, Nikki, is this right, is because there's no jurisdiction for Texas law enforcement to now come and like fetch them and compel them to go and do their jobs?
That's exactly right. And I have to say, it's something that they probably learned from their predecessors in 1979. I mean, if we're thinking about what's unprecedented here, deciding to redraw the districts in 2003. That was an unprecedented thing to do.
Meaning because it wasn't right in 2000, it was sort of in the middle, roughly in the middle of a census cycle?
Exactly. It had been 2 years since they'd been redrawn, and they're normally redrawn. And before, they'd always been redrawn every 10 years. But Democrats had done this before. In 1979, they went into hiding in order to avoid a quorum being called. It wasn't about redistricting. It was about when the presidential primary was going to be. But they hid from law enforcement so that they couldn't be dragged back in to create a quorum. And if you had been living in Texas at the time, you would know that the police were going around and trying to round up lawmakers. And if you know how law enforcement works, you know that you can get across that state line and suddenly you're outside of the jurisdiction. And that's exactly what happened. They ran to states that were run by Democrats in order to hide out so that they wouldn't be rounded up.
They hid out at a Holiday Inn in Ardmore, Oklahoma, which is now a quality hotel off of Interstate 35. Yeah, good to know.
I can recall the television helicopters looking over the scenes and watching them and wondering when they come back across the border. It just was like, it's just so crazy.
So when you pull a stunt like this, I think stunt is the right word, principled stand, but also a stunt, is the end game to like change the legislation, or is it just to get national attention and hope that enough sort of scandal erupts that then that changes people's motivations and their calculus and so forth?
I would say that the hope in that situation is to essentially try and run out the clock and hope that pressure builds, because obviously you're going to have to come back across the border at some point. The hope is that, this is completely unlawful, or not unlawful, but certainly outside the realms or the bounds of normal political discourse. But the fact is, as I was recalling it, that to me doesn't strike me as particularly realistic. But it's also like if you're a kid and you're trying to not get in trouble, you kind of run away from home for a little bit, knowing full well that you're going to have to come back home eventually, but somehow at the time, it seems like a good idea to try and delay the inevitable.
Right. And the metaphor sticks actually nicely because your parents, who you think you're like getting an upper hand on, they're just like, that kid's going to get scared before I lose my patience. And, that's kind of what Rick Perry did here. He was the governor of Texas at the time, and he knew that, eventually I'm going to be able to call some special sessions, get this legislation through, and get these new lines written. So, yeah, it did create some attention. So, there are some notable names in here. We can end on this, but Rick Perry, governor of Texas at that point, but then also Tom DeLay, an incredibly powerful figure mixed up in this scandal. Nikki, do you want to talk a little bit about how he plays in here and what this teaches us about him?
Yeah, so DeLay was looking for ways to help Republicans really secure their hold on power in Texas. As Harry said, it was now a red state. Texans were more Republican than they were Democratic, and he was looking for a way to enshrine that in the rules in these legislative districts. But he's pouring a lot of money into it through some PACs that he runs. And in the process of doing that, he violates campaign finance law. He's dealing with a name some of our listeners will know, Jack Abramoff, and gets caught up just a few years later in a series of scandals that will ultimately end his political career that can, I think, arguably be traced back to this moment.
That's exactly right. This is a Texas story, but it's not just a Texas story. It's a national story. It was about gaining seats in the 2004 elections. And in fact, without the Texas redistricting, the Democrats would have gained seats in the House. But because of the mid-decade redistricting, the Democrats actually lost seats in the House. But of course, at the end of the day, in 2002, even though Texas Democrats won a majority of seats coming from Texas, they actually lost the vote by about 10 points, which gives you an idea that even though it was redistricting, it might have been redistricting on something that was probably a gerrymander to begin with.
Right. So one last thing. What does this teach us about norms and rules and, when legislators take a stand that pushes outside of norms and rules? Maybe it's just me, but I sense we're in a time now where people are doing more of this, trying to gum up the mechanics of democracy a little bit more to take principled stands. And a lot of it is because each side is telling themselves, well, the other side is doing this, and so we're going to be empowered to do it too, and we're going to hold up nominations, or we're going to not show up for votes, or we're going to filibuster or whatever. So, Nikki, where's your head at in terms of what counts as a principled stand and what counts as breaking the rules that are there to make our politics work?
Well, it ultimately, I think, comes down to what side you're on. whether you support what the person is going after or whether you don't. I mean, I don't know that there is a broad constituency for norms writ large, because in both of these cases, whether you're looking at the Republicans or the Democrats in this Texas case, you can say that major norms were violated. And for Republicans, it led to them being able to get an earlier hold on power in the state of Texas. And for Democrats, it might have elevated the issue of redistricting in ways that would prove beneficial for their base later on. So, I don't think that there are any absolutes when it comes to defensive norms, fortunately or unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a reminder that anytime you see someone behaving in politics, whether you believe them or not, you should understand that they have convinced themselves that they're doing it because someone else did something first. And everyone is just much more comfortable acting in a sort of reactive mode and a counter-punching mode, as our president would put it, than being the first one to do something that feels like rule-breaking.
See any debate about Supreme Court nominations for evidence.
Exactly, yeah. All right, that's the end of the show. Nicole Hemmer, thank you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Harry Enten, thanks to you.
Shalom.
Harry will be back with us for one more episode. That's the next episode. By the way, we should note that this isn't a completely unique practice, what we just discussed. You may remember that Wisconsin lawmakers fled that state in 2011 to prevent a vote on an anti-union bill. Just last year, Republicans in Oregon fled to avoid a showdown on climate legislation. And the Killer D's, the House representatives in Texas we just talked about, a few months later, a group of state senators, the Texas 11, tried the same tactic. They went to New Mexico, not Oklahoma. So I don't know what the lesson is here. When faced with a fight, go camp out in a hotel or something. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. You can find out lots more about the show, including how to suggest a topic at thisdaypod.com. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Next episode, Thursday, we're sticking with more recent history, and with Texas, we're going to talk about the career of Ron Paul. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.